Okay, just a couple of short little slides here, videos. What American Romanticism wasn't, okay? I'll start with wasn't. I hate to begin negatively and negatively define something, but it wasn't merely a European or British import. I think that's important to realize. Everybody reads British romantic poets and writers, and they say, why aren't the American ones like that? Well, they are, and they aren't. First of all, you know that American Romanticism came, gosh, several decades after the British, so what do you expect? Secondly, it's a different country. But I also want you to remember this, and that is that Romanticism in the United States gained its momentum from a desire for cultural independence. What do I mean by that? Well, we had gained our political independence. We had gained our sort of military independence, especially after the War of 1812, made it very clear that the British weren't coming back in the same way. We were not going to be recolonized. But where the United States differed is that Romanticism came about in this country at about the same time that the whole country was struggling with the question of, well, who are we anyway? We're not British, but what are we? Okay? And so the desire was for greater cultural independence. We, for example, come out with our own dictionary, Webster's New American Dictionary. See that down in the bottom? An American dictionary of the English language intended to exhibit all of the different traits and characteristics and such and pronunciations of American English. That was part of this period of the 18 teens and 20s and 30s where the country was trying to establish its cultural independence because we'd already gained our political independence. Ever wonder why we spell words differently than the British, or we use different words? We say bathroom, they say lavatory. We spell the word color and theater differently and all of these kinds of things. This is because Noah Webster comes out and says, well, in America, this is our version of English. We have our own version of English, and this is it. And so a Webster's dictionary is literally a dictionary of American English. Okay, you also see this kind of in pronunciations. Why, you ever wondered why we say the word bath rather than bath? Okay, it was simply a shift in pronunciations of vowel sounds that began in the 18 teens and 20s, when it became, some think anyway, hypothesize, that it was less fashionable to sound British after the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. It became more fashionable to adopt or affect a more American dialect. So much so that Hawthorne, whose family used to spell his name H-A-T-H-O-R-N-E, not H-A-W-T-H, right? When he was going to Bowdoin College, had to insert the W into his name. Originally, it didn't have a W, but by that point in the 1820s, 1828, 1829, what have you, people would look at a name like H-A-T-H-O-R-N-E the way we would and say Hathorne, right? They wouldn't say Hawthorne. But in fact, it was pronounced Hawthorne. It always was pronounced Hawthorne. It was always spelled without a W, and it was pronounced like Bath or Father or any other word like that. It's just that people began to say the word bath rather than Bath, and they began to pronounce it Hath rather than Hoth. And he got tired of it, I guess, and said, no, it's Hawthorne. But it doesn't look like Hawthorne. It looks like Hathorne. Well, it is. It's Hawthorne. We ought to put a W in it. So he did. Those kinds of things, right? Just little subtle kinds of things where it became fashionable to be more American than British. So there's a certain nationalistic flavor that to American Romanticism that you might not see, for example, in British or French or German Romanticism and so on. It's not so much a backlash against Enlightenment as it is an expansion of it. We'll see that, particularly when you get to people like Poe, for example, who's very much, and also Emerson as well, who embraces the Enlightenment, thinks of themselves as being a more enlightened product of the Enlightenment, that Romanticism was more enlightened than Enlightenment, not a rejection of it. We're also living in a post-revolutionary world, both American and French. Listen, the American Revolution went fairly well, particularly from our perspective. We're all benefiting from its, good byproducts. Not everybody did, obviously. White males who were free property owners and whatnot came out doing pretty well. Others, well, not quite so well. On the other hand, looking back over 200 years, we're all here probably pretty glad we had one. And though it didn't extend the blessings of liberty to everyone equally at the outset, it was a pretty good first start, and we're glad that it happened rather than if it didn't, right? So in other words, we look at the American Revolution as having come having been a fairly positive thing. The British and others around the world, once the French Revolution came along, said, you know what, revolutions can sometimes be pretty nasty, ugly, bloody affairs. And the French Revolution, even the French look at it with very mixed emotions. Back when the French Revolution's bicentennial occurred, I know that, when people celebrated Bastille Day, it's a little gruesome walking down the street and seeing vendors selling little miniature toy guillotines as souvenirs. It is a very, very mixed thing, and the French have very mixed emotions about it. It spiraled out of control. The Reign of Terror was a horrible thing, and it really was a culture that collapsed in upon itself. And so when the American Romantic period comes along, on the one hand, revolution is seen as something in the United States that gave us our independence, gave us assurances of liberty, gave us a new form of government that theoretically was supposed to, and I think in hindsight certainly did, begin the process anyway of extending liberty to as many people as possible. But they also bore in mind that the excesses of revolution, the French Revolution in particular, could lead to a nightmare. It's a two-edged sword, in other words. It's not also a Byronic world to American Romantics. What do I mean by that? Byron, the guy who was just all about excess, who was all about experiencing everything, who was all about sort of exploring the darker, sort of more demonic aspects of human nature. There's some of that. Certainly there's some of that. But it's never seen as an end in itself in American Romanticism. It's for every Ahab that you have, he's always presented as being self-destructive. Whereas with Byron, exploring the darker side of humanity is something that's simply a yin and yang kind of thing. That's what we ought to do. It's in our nature. We ought to explore the darker elements, the darker side of human nature, the more self-indulgent, the more sensual and hedonistic. You don't see that in American Romanticism so much. If you do see it within certain characters, it's almost always presented by way of criticism of that sort of thing. The dark, self-absorbed, all-consuming individual is castigated in Hawthorne, is castigated in Poe. It's explored, yes, but in terms of where the writers come down in terms of moral assessments of those kinds of characters, it's very unambiguous in many respects. And that's a product of the fact that the country came about, at least in its early years, with a very strong dose of Puritanism, and it was a highly religious country. So it's not a Byronic sort of romanticism. You won't see that. You'll see individuals embracing radical individualism, but not in an effort to explore the darker side of human nature. Right? Next slide.